Now, I get this from finance, I get it from engineering leaders, I get it from engineers, and the answer I always give that is tongue-in-cheek is, it is dev. And they're like, what? No, I really need to know. And I'm like, no, seriously, it is dev. And there's some reason for that. What is dev? Well, it's actually where production costs are born. That's where they start. We're writing a new feature, we're writing a new service. I wrote some stuff, and we're going to deploy it. And along with that awesome code, with that new feature or that new thing that we want to get in our customers' hands, also comes scale, instance choices, inefficiencies, weird bugs. All of that starts in dev. Now, looks differ. Dev can be on engineers' laptops. It can be in a weird simulation thing where you have a test suite you can run against it, or it's a full environment just like production, but it's small. But all of those decisions, their first start point for us, we learned very quickly, is that those decisions were being made by engineers sitting at their desks writing code. Now, culture. Ultimately, what it came down to for us is we made a transition to a world of, to give some background, I started in FinOps in an environment where they're like, look, we're not ready to optimize costs just yet. We were a startup, we were working on a product, we had a whole bunch of features, and we weren't really ready to start revving on that. But what we knew is that we needed to have a culture in place that was ready to do that when the time came. And that was very short duration, but it was very important for us to answer these types of questions. Do engineering teams own the cost of their systems? I wish this had a laser so I could lightsaber own. Essentially what I mean by own is not just reporting on it and not just going to meetings talking about it, but they actually control it, just like a car. If you own a car, well, you own the keys, the insurance, you put gas in it, you pay for it, and you get real upset when somebody runs into it. It's the same thing with the ownership of our systems. Do they actually control their own systems? Do we study our systems? Just like any discipline, do you study it? Do you have data about it? Do you learn about how it behaves in the natural world? Do we have goal and organizational alignment? When push comes to shove, do we know that there are things that exist, constructs that when we talk to leadership or we talk to an engineer, they know that there's a goal that everybody has that we can all talk towards? How fast is our feedback loop? I'm going to talk more about this because this is a very important one for us. But essentially, how fast do we see changes, make changes, and actually see it in data, not only in an ops side of the world for like CPU and memory, but also in cost? Do engineering as individuals know where they fit? Not just from an HR, do they know where their cost of goods sold goes? Do they know how that's all calculated? And then when it comes to prioritization, this was a big one for us. What does that discussion look like when it comes down to cost optimization? How do we navigate having a discussion about prioritization? Right, so how do we do this? So how stuff gets done. This is an actual conversation I had with an engineer about 6 years ago, and basically I observed that there was an EBS volume configuration on our deployment systems that was basically orphaning EBS volumes. Many of us have been there where there's a bunch of EBS volumes just sitting there doing nothing. I talked to the engineer and he said, basically, yes. He was like, hey, yeah, you're totally right. We're not going to use that feature anymore. That was kind of something that we had tested and didn't really work out. We should totally change that. 3 months later, nothing. Not one thing has changed. And what we learned is that we were interacting with engineers not at the currency that they use to prioritize their initiatives. What we were doing is talking to them through emails and maybe talking to them at their desks, but we were not doing something extremely important, and that was submitting the mighty JIRA ticket. You see, what we learned very quickly is that at planning meetings, what do engineering teams do? They look at their backlog, they look at the things that are coming from PM, they look at all those, and then they balance what can we get done, what makes sense. So we started with a humble JIRA ticket, put in actual PRs to actually just have them review, so that it was very easy for them to implement. And this got it so that all of a sudden we had meetings where they were looking at their backlog and they were saying, hey, there's a few things that Riley and his team have submitted. Maybe we could get those done. It started slowly, but we started seeing a trickle of these initiatives coming in and getting done. 2 weeks after this was actually made into a real ticket, it was actually implemented by an engineer who was bored for 30 minutes and said, hey, that's a softball, I can totally get that done. And that's grown where now we have discussions looking at what tickets we've tagged and highlighted fall under the FinOps world, and they actually get prioritized and done. Okay, the feedback loop. This is the one that probably took the most amount of technical work on my part. So engineers are inherently lookers of data. It just depends on if they have data that they can actually look at that allows them to see changes and their effect. It's instant gratification issue. So in the monitoring world, if you change your instance type to a bigger instance, your CPU utilization goes down, and you can see that in near real time. There's lots of platforms that do that. But for cost and configuration changes, that was very difficult. So what we focused on is bringing all of our cost data into a place where they could view it all, and not only view their costs, but also all their configurations. This is a screenshot of one of the charts, and that little A designates one of our engineers that worked on a new initiative to reduce some S3 operations. That's actually a count of our API calls, which translates to cost. This is something that it updates every 4 hours, so they can look and see, oh, I made this cost, or we had this code rollout, or a configuration change, and they can correlate those with direct costs in almost a 4-hour cycle, which has been something that they have a very quick feedback loop to look at. This took a lot of training, where essentially we had to show them, hey, this is the place where you look. You know, you're used to looking at this in whatever observability platform, logging system, whatever. The same rules apply, the same tags, the same way you look up an instance or the same way you look up an environment, it exists here. But also, here's the list of all the configuration changes that not we did, but you did. And so they could start understanding that when they make a change, it does impact costs. Now, the really important part of this is that we actually started backwards. We started in production, and I wish to this day that we'd actually started in dev. Because the thing that we learned is that we actually had the same capability in dev. We were focused on production because it was, you know, there was lots of money being spent there. But ultimately, this is the thing that made it so that they could rev very quickly, so that when production features went live, they didn't have inefficiencies as much as they had previously. My favorite thing that has happened with this is I had an engineer come to me and said, hey, I worked on this thing. I'm going to reduce the S3 cost by 50%. Which is like mind-blowing for a data platform company. He did that, we launched it, and it was awesome. And I was involved, not at all. I made no decisions, didn't even point it out to him. I just said, you know, they had their dashboard, they had their data, and they effectively ran it themselves. I'm really struggling with this clicker here. All right. If any of you have written any code against a new technology, you typically start with, I know nothing about this, and you get on their website. They have documentation, and they have a hello world or something like that, if it's a new database or whatever. We had nothing like that. We were asking engineering to make changes to optimize their cost with no basis of like, this is the place where you can start from vanilla. So what we made is a location in our documentation. That's an actual screenshot of the very first one that we made. But essentially what we gave them is a place where they could run a hello world in dev, where they could say, hey, this is how to change an instance type with an exact example, so that they could actually go in and upscale, downscale, change their settings, and do whatever they needed to. This has become a home for documentation where we can send new engineers and even seasoned engineers that are used to it on new features that we're rolling out. For example, when we rolled out Spot adoption in production, all the documentation went there. People were used to it, and it's now called FinOps Hello World in our documentation. Names change about 30 times, but I keep changing it to the same thing, FinOps Hello World. All right, making Devscale. This is how to make yourself very unpopular, but it was good for us. So the typical engineering laptop, if you have a MacBook Pro, has 16 gigs of RAM, CPU varies. And so all of our systems, when they're first written and they're running them on their local machines, have that barrier. So the problem is that we had engineers that were launching servers in our dev environment that were always about that size. So what we noticed is that we're like, well, this was effectively right sizing, but what we decided to do is we actually put dev on essentially a diet. We worked with individual teams, and we started downscaling their systems, because the answer was, well, I put it on that size of a R5 4 extra large because that's what I did. Not really a great answer. And what we found is that we actually were able to improve our production scaling operations by actually scaling that intentionally down until we started to see the cracks. Now most of our dev environments actually are on whatever micro instance, the smallest instance we can go. And that has been painful for some engineers who had to learn the hard way that they had built something inherently inefficient into their system. But it also has gotten us to the point where we know a scaling issue much earlier in our cycle, way before it reaches production. All right, so that's how to make yourself an enemy. To make yourself a hero, in the same kind of a vein, is that we had our production systems. We build our code, we have to test it. That build pipeline for some teams was taking up to 45 minutes. And I'm an engineer. If I had to wait 45 minutes for anything, for my code to get tested, I'd lose my mind. So we reached out to that team and we asked why. And they're like, well, we can't spend that much money. At 45 minutes later, we actually said, hey, let's scale up the dev build systems so that we can get that in 5 minutes. So that has been something that we've had to negotiate, and we've become the enemy and become the hero by doing things like that. But essentially, making Devscale has led to us being able to identify early how production scales. All right. The definition of done is a cultural thing that we have at Domo, but essentially it is a list. It is a checklist of things. And it's everything from, okay, do you have logging? Do you have monitoring? Do you have alerting? Does your feature look good? Does it perform well? But none of that had anything to do with cost. And this took a lot of adoption from our senior leadership and talking to them and saying, okay, what kind of discussions do you want to have at what level? Because you don't want to, the first discussion around a new feature should not be how much it should cost, in my opinion. But we wanted to get people aware of that we're looking at this. This is something we want to build into our definition of done. So what we said is, okay, 3 questions, very simple. What is the minimum deployment size of your system and feature? Which is a simple question, but it sets the stage where we want to know how much the zero state of your system is going to be. How much does that cost? Which is a separate question. We don't actually ask them to do anything RIs. We say, just give us the public on-demand cost. But that helps them get familiar with, we are going to ask those questions. And then thirdly, when do you scale your system and how? At what point, what's your unit of scale up when you have to? How do you identify that? And how do you do that? Are they bigger instances? Is there a certain amount that you have to scale up for whatever reason? Or do you go wide? Just so that we can have a good idea of it. The first time we implemented this, it was very painful because a lot of engineers had never been asked these questions before, and they were very grumpy about it. But it is now part of, we've made it simple on that how to do FinOps, the Hello World page. We actually have a demo of how to come up with these numbers so that they don't end up in the deep end. Basically what this has allowed us to have is when we do the definition of done for any new feature, we're in the discussion from the beginning. And at first it was hard, but after about 6 months, engineers were used to, we're going to ask these questions, and it's going to be something that they're going to have to deal with. All right, celebration. Now at Domo, this is the chicken trophy. It actually has a really weird name derived from Elvish. I can't remember it, but we call it the chicken trophy. And the chicken trophy is it's more of a representation of Domo as a culture in general, but we celebrate a lot. There's lots of employee recognition. It's a thing that I actually very appreciate in our culture at Domo. But one of the things that we're able to do is just celebrate other people's great solutions that they've written. But this really didn't have a footprint in cost optimization, just kind of by merit of where we started. But what we decided to do is, along with these when we first started, very simple code changes or very simple solutions, we decided to actually put in celebrations and awards for those. And not really just to celebrate a dollar value, but it was really to reinforce the culture of, hey, we care about what our impact is to the company. And so we want to make sure that we're celebrating that. And that started small, but that's led to, now we've given a couple team awards for major initiatives. And that's something that frequently we're doing, say, good job to this team. You guys went out of your way and built something that was more efficient and great. Now I have time for Q&A. How much time do I have? So I've talked super fast, by the way. It is one of my great speaking failures. Does anybody have any questions? I'll take anything.
Yeah, hold on. I'm going to bring you the mic because we are recording this, and that way it will be recorded for prosperity's sake. I'm going to walk slow since he talks so fast.
I do.
You stand right here.
So you mentioned updates at 4-hour intervals, intraday?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
we basically as fast as we can get it from the provider, we crunch it, and then our anything that we get from our environment control systems like Git or our monitoring systems comes in much more frequently.
So are those more operational metrics, or are you getting actual cost values or forecasts?
Cost values as fast
Okay.
as we can get them.
Okay.
We basically make it so that it's all public costs, so that we don't have to worry about RI coverage and things that I may do from a central disciplinary action that may violently change costs. We actually learned that the hard way when I made my first RI conversion, and RIs drifted away from another team, and they had an aneurysm. They were very freaked out that their costs went up 2x. So yeah, we had to deal with that, but that's how we treat that. Go ahead.
So I'm just looking at some of the snapshots I made of the slides, but you said you get the teams to use public pricing for costs.
Mm-hmm.
So in our organization, that sort of worked backwards. It's backfired on us because they start saying it's too expensive because they don't see the efficiencies that the
Right.
FinOps team incorporated.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts around that?
So that's one that we
Continue to use
have bounced back and forward all over the place. And basically what we have is a view of how much it actually costs versus what is the happy path, what it costs. Because they can't guarantee that they're going to be covered with RIs at any given time. Maybe there's an expiration, we haven't yet purchased it. Maybe there's a day or two gap. We dealt with that a lot. The other thing that we've dealt with is that, well, spot instances actually change that discussion. So we've had to merge that. So we actually have two views where they can see more real world costs versus what their public costs, so they can balance that. And that data is highly dimensional. So it's not just a view into, okay, this is how much your system costs, and it's just a big number over time. They can actually slice and dice it so they can see, okay, this is by environment or region or instance type. That way they can kind of know a very familiar context of what they would see like in a monitoring system that's purely monitoring. The same dimensions they can parse in our costing dashboards so that they can get a feel, and it feels very familiar to them. And that's what we really strove for, is that we want familiarity. We want the ability for them to look at like our monitoring systems and look at our cost dashboards and know the lingo, know the language, and it's not going to be a totally different world.
So on that 6-month time period that you outlined where you were asking people to present the done state, how much of that after that 6-month period do you feel like you need to still sort of work with product managers to handhold for achieving that done state? Or do you feel like they really are, sort of bought in and are at a state where they can just do this themselves?
Yeah, mostly my role now, it used to be my role was very much like pushing all the time and like, playing the music so that the band kept marching. But now really what it is I see teams and we have a benchmark that basically allows them to compare themselves over time and with other teams, because their spend will be different depending on what features they own. But yeah, my role now is owning RIs and doing all that kind of stuff, central operations, but it's a lot of trainings and making sure that they understand these are their numbers and noticing when they slip. We leave it up to teams to have their own alerts on their costs, but we do have some central alerts to know if the ship has started to sink a little, so that we can then re-inject some, hey, it's time for a FinOps training, which is lingo to them that you missed something, there's something that we want to address with your team because it looks like there may be something going on. So it kind of depends, but we're always kind of making sure that that cycle is self-sustaining, but when it needs help, we'll jump in and help the team out.
Okay, I've got a couple over here, Riley, for you.
So you mentioned a culture of recognition. Did you guys experiment at all with like gamification across teams or anything along those lines?
So this may be controversial, but gamification is not a substitute for ownership, in my opinion. If you don't have ownership, it's a great way to get there, but it's not. I don't view I don't view that as being something that's self-sustaining, because it's like it's always an event type of a thing. So we've that's how we started. We said, hey, let's show everybody's numbers and see who can do the best at reduction. But eventually, it's really the ownership and the real ownership of their systems that's really gotten us to where we wanted to be. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
You mentioned a centralized discounting body that you head up. How often are you surprised by costs that are not covered by public discounts, and what's your strategy to remediate?
So because that is all, that comes down to one of the decisions we made very early, and none of that is controlled by any organization outside of our SRE FinOps role. So what's nice about that is, since I'm involved in dev and since my team is involved in the whole stack from top to bottom, we know when RIs are expiring. We know the context of when they expire, how to purchase them, and how to go about that. But we also know what is coming, because we are involved in dev so much. And so how that translates is that a lot of our purchases, we'll even hold off a purchase and let things expire, because we know that a new feature is coming that's going to make it so we can scale down. So we manage all of those, the rate optimization things centrally, but because we're hooked into the how we get code out there, we can actually schedule things and know a lot more about what's coming from a reservation standpoint. So it's led us to be able to operate a high percentage of coverage.
All right over here. And I'll get
Yep.
next.
Can you expand a little bit on the SRE plus FinOps in your organization?
Yeah, so that really, to me, if I could summarize that, it's all about risk communication. An SRE, a good SRE org is not going to come to a team and tell them something that doesn't make sense. Because we understand the context of risk around a feature or downscaling, both on the reliability, performance, and sustainability side on how our product functions, that also translates to when we communicate a FinOps initiative, when we're saying, hey, we want to use spot instances in production, they don't look at you like you're nuts. And they don't look at you and say, no, there's no way you can do that, because they know that if they get woken up in the middle of the night because their system is down because they downscaled, most likely the SRE team is going to be right there to support them and make sure that they have the data. So it's something where we know the risks of what we're asking at all times. So that's one of the biggest benefits that we've played by interacting those two roles.
Is it inclusive of performance testing?
Yes, yeah. So it's the whole SRE world plus how much does it cost. That's actually how I personally got started, because I was only an SRE to start, but then it was, hey, there's a new instance type, it's faster, better network, all this stuff. Oh wait, and it costs less, and that cost discussion kept being looped in, and here I am today.
Do you have any recommendations how to apply this model for large corporations where you have a couple dozens of development teams and holding them accountable? It's not easy. I just wonder if you can elaborate a little bit.
So full disclosure, I've never worked for a huge super organization, but
Especially if we're pushing it to self-service.
Right. Yeah.
So that situation.
What it comes down to for me is making sure there's a baseline of data to make decisions from. Things like how you organize your accounts, how you differentiate your costs with your tagging strategy. If that is a bedrock that you can make good decisions, it helps everybody talk the same language. Everybody knows server count. Everybody knows, how much storage we have. Those are things. It should be a very similar discussion on, like, okay, when we talk about your cost allocation, the way we allocate cost is with this account structure or this tag. Starting there allows you to get the right data in front of people so they can make the right decisions and be self-serving.
All right, we'll have a couple more questions after
Yeah.
this. We have about 5 more minutes, so here you go.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. You talked about the cost as a driving factor for engineers. Was utilization also one of the driving factors?
Yeah, so really where we kind of they have different views into their data, so they'll be able to see this is how many servers were active, or this is how much storage they have. They have their cost view too. From a utilization perspective, we don't really worry them too much about their RI utilization unless we have a team that maybe said, hey, we want to go 3-year standard instances because there's a cost advantage to that. If you're a team like that, then me and them are a lot closer friends because they have to make sure that they stay into what they agreed to use. But any other teams, we don't really have them worry too much about their RI coverage or utilization. As long as they are right-sizing their services and they don't have a lot of unused capacity, which they'll show up on my radar in their own metrics, we let them kind of do their own thing as long as they're not showing up on, big cost anomalies or things like that, that we would then get involved in and be a little bit more, hovering over their shoulders to see what's going on.
All right, you're next.
So I'm curious what mechanism you're using to associate a cloud resource with, say, a Git repo, so you can, create those tickets and PRs and whatever else.
Yeah. So we actually do that in our own product. So no sales pitches, but we do that in our own product. There's actually lots of ways to do it, but essentially and it comes down to this question, how would you get lots of separate things that have different structures into the same language? And our tagging strategy, for example, in our code base, that configuration file that I sent, that actually has the tagging that is applied to their instance. So what's cool about that is if they make a tagging change or an instance size change, we pull that into a section of data into our systems that then would allow us to correlate that piece of information that changed with the cost at that time. And that's essentially how we're doing that. It's a lot of data processing. That's one of my roles, is I manage all of the cat herding to make sure that data is present. But essentially it allows us to say, hey, you made this change at X time, and look at what your costs did at that time too.
So my question's a little bit off of his. I saw that you put kind of like event-based overlays along with like usage and cost data. What sort of event-based overlays would you pull in?
So auto-scaling is a big one. Some systems we allow to auto-scale unchecked as long as they operate within a very large bandwidth. But as part of that, we also need to know when the system decides, as per its configuration, to make some changes. So every time one of those scaling operations happen, we have an event that's put basically on an event bus that we shove in a database, and then we bring that in so that we can have it available. So it's things from scaling changes to code releases to production issues that are happening in a cloud provider, like the AWS status changes are actually piped into that same system so that we can have kind of all of it right there. It's actually the dashboard is actually named for a while, did anything change, ... Yes, all the time. So the name changed because they didn't like that, but I have lots of tongue-in-cheek answers to life, so that's where I started.
That's good. Okay, we have time for like one more question if anybody has one. God, why did I just stand right in front of that?
Yeah, that's bright.
Anyone? Okay, we're gonna do one question, but nobody can leave until we really applaud him out of here. So hold on a second, because I do have that internal competition that nobody knows about but me. Hold on.
Oh boy.
Thanks, Riley. Yeah, so you mentioned like being the hero as well as the villain, right? Like the hero, scaling up and making builds happen faster. Are there other? I think it's a perfect example of cloud's, flexible, elastic value prop. I was wondering if you had any example vocabulary or discussions to help equip people here to have conversations like that.
Leave it to Stephen to ask the hard questions. No, for us, it was really just understanding that, look, our engineers, they do what's prioritized for them a lot of times. Like, they don't get to pick how the product looks. But when we talk about things like, where we started is like, look, you are running RTX 3090 and you're playing Pac-Man. That was one of the discussions. That was actually the title of a training session that we did for them to understand. One time, we actually did you are logging a lot to disk, which makes it so we have to have a lot of disk. And we said, okay, this amount of data that you're using represents X portion of the total amount in the Library of Congress. So you write the Library of Congress every 30 seconds. Are you sure you need that? Things like that. Like bringing things into real world context in areas that they own has always been super advantageous for us, because they can kind of say, oh, that connects it to the real world, and it connects it to what we'd want to do from an optimization standpoint.
Amazing.
Thanks.
You so much, Riley. Everybody, a big round of applause for Mr. Riley Jenkins here. If you do have questions for him, please find him out anywhere. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer questions after this. But until then, thanks, everybody.
JR here from the FinOps Foundation. Thank you for watching. Please go to FinOps.org if you want to get plugged into this amazing community. And of course, hit subscribe right here on YouTube to get all the future content. Hope to see you soon.